So good afternoon and evening, everyone. Feels like evening because it's so dark out. Thanks for joining us tonight for a conversation about equity, diversity, and inclusion at Carleton. My name is Carly, and I am one of the national recruitment officers here in undergraduate recruitment at Carleton. And during these Live at Fives, we talk about a lot of different topics, and I'm really happy that today, on our last Live at Five, we can talk about one that's really, really important on our campus. And I think that we're doing a lot in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion at Carleton to create a welcoming space for you folks who are coming to join our community. But that doesn't mean that we still don't have, a lot of work to be done and things that can move us even more forward in this conversation. So really happy to have you here today. Just before we get started, I want to start with how we start all of our presentations, and especially important during our conversation about EDI today is that Carleton University acknowledges that the location of its campus is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. This is really important because even though we're all tuning in from different spaces and places today, it is important to know that when you come to Carleton and you move to Ottawa, that the place that you're going to be growing and learning and playing is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. And one of my colleagues, his name is Macho. He is the community liaison officer with the Algonquin people. So we are doing, a great job here at Carleton again, but lots of work still to be done. So just want to take a moment and acknowledge where we are located because it is beautiful and it's important to acknowledge that location. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our special guest today. They are a graduate of our Bachelor of Communications programs with a minor in Drama Studies, as well as currently the coordinator for trans and non-binary gender inclusion in our Office of Equity and Inclusive Communities. So I'm really happy to have Jamie here today to tell us a little bit about their role here on campus and how they're working to create a more inclusive community here at Carleton. So I'll pass it over to you, Jamie.
Awesome. Thank you, Carly, for that introduction and for having me tonight. So my name is Jamie. I use they, them pronouns, and I work as the Trans and Non-Binary Inclusion Coordinator in Carleton's Department of Equity and Inclusive Communities. So maybe I'll start by talking a little bit about what our department does and then talk about my role. So Equity and Inclusive Communities is kind of the department that's tasked with making sure that Carleton's a safe institution for all the students, faculty, and staff that attend it. And our office's focuses are kind of threefold. So we do discrimination and harassment, accommodation, and response. We do education for students, faculty, and staff about issues of equity and inclusion, and we do like policy development and consultation. So those last two are kind of the ones that my role is really focused on. So that means if the university is developing a new policy, we make sure that it's considering all the different identities of the folks who are on campus. And we facilitate lots of different sessions for faculty, staff, and students to kind of help them understand the experiences of their colleagues and their peers. So one example of that is the Carleton University Safer Space program, which has existed for about 5 years now, and that's kind of an introduction to the kind of definitions and identities that make up the 2S LGBTQ+ community, and then what the needs are of that community specifically on campus. And then, like I said, the last piece of the puzzle for equity is discrimination and harassment response. So if a student needs an accommodation based on a piece of their identity, so a really common one for us, for example, is Muslim students needing accommodations around Ramadan for exams and that kind of thing. That's something that our department handles. And then if someone feels like a professor or a colleague or a peer has maybe said something that created an environment that wasn't safe for them to learn in, our department are the ones that kind of tackle that as well. And so within that wider picture, my role is focused specifically on the needs of trans and non-binary students, faculty, and staff, but students especially because they're the biggest population on our campus. And I approach that kind of really from an infrastructural perspective. So like, how can the buildings and the bathrooms and the athletics facilities on campus be more inclusive and safer for trans people. I don't do that work alone, thankfully, because it's a big job. I work really closely with what's called the Carleton Trans Advocacy Group, which is a group of faculty and students who are either part of the trans community or allies with that community, and they kind of guide my work and my focus. So kind of saying, hey, this is what we think is a real important priority for us right now. So for example, last year, when everything was online, we kind of decided that physical infrastructure like bathrooms maybe wasn't as important because no one was on campus. And so instead we're focused more on making sure that all the systems and stuff that Carleton uses, that it was easy for students to change their name and pronouns through those systems. Yeah, so I feel very lucky to get to do the work I do. Like Carly said, I was a student at Carleton, and I came out as trans while I was a student. And so this role really feels like a way for me to be able to give back to my community and take the experience I had at Carleton and use it to do good. Yeah.
Awesome, and that's a great kind of place to kick off our Q&A. And just for those of you who are joining us, feel free to post any questions that you might have for Jamie or about Carleton in the chat. Rather the Q&A, and we're happy to tackle them. Jamie, you mentioned that you were a student, as did I, and if you could talk a little bit about why you chose to come to Carleton. Just in general, we're talking to prospective students tonight who are, making that big decision. So why did you choose to come to Carleton in the first place?
Yeah, so I'll say, like I said, I came out as trans while I was already a student. So I know a lot of folks that's like trans safety is something they're considering while they're applying to university. It wasn't something I was thinking about because I didn't know that about myself then. I chose Carleton because I came for a tour when I was in grade 12. It was actually on Halloween of my grade 12 year. And I just felt a real contrast at Carleton with all the other universities I went to, that it felt really welcoming and like it was a place that all the people I talked to actually wanted me to go, whereas all the other universities I toured, it kind of felt like they didn't care whether or not I decided to go there. And I just fell in love with how beautiful the campus was and how kind of its own community it was. I really liked that you could walk to all your classes and that it was this self-contained thing. But I'll say as well that when I did come out, I came out in my second year. I was really supported by my peers and my colleagues. I was working on campus at the time, and my boss really made sure that it was easy for me to change my name and kind of come out to other students I was working with. And so that's something that I really appreciated, was that going through that process, I think, was easier than it could have been if I hadn't had the support of the folks around me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know you've had a couple of different jobs on campus, and one of them has been in residence.
Yeah.
And if you could tell us a little bit about your experience living in residence, as well as then kind of going forward and working in there, and just kind of how do you feel about the residence community in general at Carleton?
Yeah, so I did work in residence, and I obviously liked something about it because I lived and worked in residence my entire degree. So I lived there as a first year, and then I lived and worked there as a res fellow all the way until I was in fourth year. And it was really, I think, one of the most impactful things for me about residence was that like feeling of community. I just loved being able to never being more than a 5-minute walk away from my friends, and classes only being a 10-minute walk away, and just that sense of being around other students was really nice. And I found as well that residence specifically was one of the places on campus that was really kind of making an intentional effort to build a safe space for marginalized students, and for queer and trans students specifically. And that's something that now, even though I don't work there anymore, they're going even further with that, and they now have an affinity group for 2S LGBT students that's kind of funded and organized by Carleton resident staff. So a really nice way to meet other students who are part of the same community as you, and maybe you'd have things in common with. So yeah, I loved living in residence at Carleton, and obviously because I did it for 4 years in a row.
I'd hope so if you lived there for that long. We have a question that came in here from the chat, and they are wondering, did you find it hard to change your name on forms and documents once you got to school?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the process has gotten a little bit easier now than it was when I was a student. It wasn't hard, but there was just like a couple hoops I had to jump through, but now it's even more simple. So I'll preface by saying I've only changed my preferred name. I haven't changed my legal name yet. But the preferred name change process is really easy. It's one form that you submit to the registrar's office. You don't need any like documentation or reason or anything like that. If there's a name that you prefer to go by, whether it is because you're trans or for any other reason, it's just that one form. And so that normally takes like 2 or 3 business days for them to process. And then once that's done, you just email the IT department and they'll change your email as well. And once your name is changed through the registrar's office on campus, it changes everywhere else. So on Brightspace, which is like the online learning portal, and in Residence and any other system on your campus card, you have your preferred name, and anything that doesn't legally have to have your legal name would have your preferred name on it, which I think is great. And then changing your legal name is also a really simple process. Once you've done it, like through the government, you just send Carleton a letter that basically says, hey, I've changed my name, here's proof, and you give them one piece of ID. And then it's the same thing. All the systems take care of themselves once you've done that one thing. So it is a really kind of seamless process. And I think one of the things that I'm working on is catching those couple little systems that don't always talk to each other the best, but for the most part, once you've done it one place, it happens everywhere else too.
That's really good to hear. And so would their first step then be going right to the registrar's office, or would it be coming to your office? What would kind of be their first step?
Yeah, so the first step would be going to the registrar's office, and they have information on their website about how to change your name. But that information is also on the Trans Hub, which is a website I manage that's kind of just like lots of info for trans students at Carleton. So that's at carleton.ca/trans. And if you click on how to change your name, it's got all the information and any documents you need.
Okay, fantastic. I don't see any other questions coming in for the Q&A, and I know, if things do come up later, this is just kind of the beginning of this conversation for sure. The last thing I wanted to just ask you, Jamie, was do you have any advice, generally speaking, for our students who are, transitioning from high school to university and kind of taking that next step?
Yeah, I think it's kind of corny because it's what everyone says, but my number one piece of advice is always to get involved. I think especially if you live on campus in first year and then you maybe find some friends and get a house off campus in your second year, if you don't have something other than class bringing you to campus, whether it's a club or a sports team or a job, I think sometimes it can be hard, especially in the winter when it's really cold, to get up and get on the bus and make your way to campus. So having that other tether to kind of help you meet other folks on campus and also be the thing that kind of gets you to bed when nothing else is gonna was really useful for me. And that Carleton's a place where you can try new things. Like if there's a club you're interested in, but you didn't do it in high school, you should do it at university, because you're never going to be in a spot in life where there's more clubs than when you're at university and more things you can try out. So yeah, I think, does that count as advice? I kind of just rambled for a little while.
Yeah, no, it totally does. And just because you try a club doesn't mean that you have to do it for all 4 years, right? Like it's all about, that experimenting, and maybe there's something that was never available to you that now you can try out. So yeah, that's super great advice. Thanks, Jamie. Awesome. So that wraps up our Live at 5 conversation tonight. A big thank you to Jamie for joining us. It's always such a pleasure to hear from you and your experience. And we're so glad to have you as part of our Carleton community, even after graduation. It's amazing. For more information on equity and inclusive communities, you can head to carleton.ca/equity. Jamie also mentioned the Trans Hub, which can be found at carleton.ca/trans. Tons of information. And again, we're just kind of starting this conversation. So let us know if you do have any other questions that come in. Lastly, any admissions questions or information, upcoming events, you can find at admissions.carleton.ca, and never hesitate to reach out to us with any questions that you might have. So I do see a couple more questions coming in to the chat here, so we'll hang out for a little bit and answer them in the Q&A, but I hope everyone has a wonderful night, and we will chat again soon. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.